Hey folks, I hope you're all well and enjoyed Salute last weekend if you went along to it. It was great catching up with some people I hadn't seen in a while and playing a spot of GDA 2 again. Rather than doing a straightforward here's what I bought kind of video right after the show, some of which you can see here and that I'll chat about later on, I wanted to sit on my thoughts for a bit, reflect on where a couple of my own hobby projects are heading, and chat about some trends in wargaming from what was on offer. So this video is a bit more of a ramble than a straight show report, but there will be some photos of games in the background and images for illustration of points I'm making. First things first, a huge thank you to the organisers of the event for putting on such a great showcase of the hobby, as well as to everyone involved in running games and all the traders. Year on year, it feels like it keeps getting bigger and bigger as a show in terms of sheer numbers of hobbyists attending, as well as attracting a more diverse crowd, so good signs for the health of the hobby. And I certainly wasn't the only one noticing how far into the afternoon things stayed busy around the hall as well, with people still dropping in on participation games and making purchases well after the point things would normally have died down in the past. So, on to the point of the video, and my slight bit of sensationalism in the title about the influence of Games Workshop, or the GWification if you like, of product launches. This all came about because I've been thinking ahead to when I reached the original goal for my Prussian collection, of completing one of the brigades or small divisions that fought at Leipzig. I'm not there yet, of course, so there's still plenty to do on that project, but eventually I would like to move on to having a second period that I can work on in tandem with Napoleonics for a touch more variety on the historical side of things. I'll come to what that is later in the video, but it all got me thinking as I wandered around Salute about how we begin a new project in historical wargaming, and how that approach differs in other sectors of the hobby, be it fantasy, sci-fi, smaller historical skirmish games, and so on. Being on the lookout for something new to collect can be a bit of a risky situation as a wargamer, thanks to that good old shiny object syndrome, where we're drawn to something largely because of its novelty, rather than considering its longevity as a product. And at a big trade fair like Salute, we're perhaps even more susceptible to this because of things like herd mentality among consumers, where our purchasing decisions are influenced by the trends of what others around us are picking up, especially so when it's a concentrated crowd of people who all share the same hobby. Now, people talk about shiny object syndrome, or becoming a hobby butterfly, a lot in our community, as though it's something that affects wargamers more than other hobbyists, and I'm not sure I really agree with that. It's just that for us, especially in the case of purchasing new figures that require assembling and painting before we can use them in a game, we're left with a more visible reminder of how little use we've got out of a product in the form of our so-called pile of shame. The exact same sort of guilt and memes about that guilt circulate in most other communities if you stick your nose into them. Things like people joking about the pile of unread books they have before going out and buying yet more. Games that languish on someone's Steam library with only 20 minutes of playtime, or in music, audio plugins, guitar pedals, and even whole instruments people just pick up on a whim. By its very nature, the complexity of historical wargaming provides what I see as a series of bumps in the road for consumers that might help to interrupt that rush from product release to shiny object syndrome to purchase to pile of shame edition. Another factor in this is the distributed nature of the hobby, with lots of little niches, with things like historical research, painting, terrain building, gaming, and so on. You could argue that just gives us 4 different categories of stuff to accumulate, but the way I see it, starting a new project in historical wargaming tends to take a lot of often fairly independent legwork from the hobbyist in terms of understanding a period before you can really launch yourself into it. Traditionally, you might pick up a few military history books and uniform guides from several different publishers, a set of rules from another, all the various figures for your chosen army, again probably in several stages, drawing from different ranges from different manufacturers, as well as some scenery, once again from another different company. Thinking back to our Salute discussion, with each of those different stages or types of product, there's a chance, I guess, to snap out of that shiny object syndrome and question where on earth you're going to store all this extra stuff in your already limited gaming space, or question if you really are that obsessed with the 5th Ottoman-Venetian War after all. This is reflected as well in the type of consumer that we tend to be as historical gamers. We are, I hope you'll forgive me from saying, fairly particular and a little bit obsessive with our interests. Even if the Perrys were to release, say, a couple of new Prussian Napoleonic codes for the Death's Head Hussars or reservists in British supplied uniforms, I wouldn't exactly be rushing to pick them up since they didn't fight as part of the core that my collection is themed around. It's harder to fall for the sales shtick and succumb to your shiny object syndrome tendencies, that is, if you have a very particular taste in mind already, and if you started doing some of your own research on a period before going out and purchasing things. And so that's why, again, traditionally, we haven't really been the type of consumer that Games Workshop has tried to target in its stores either. The savvy consumer, or some far less flattering title I'm sure they might use, who would come into a store and be able to discuss, the various marks of power armour favoured by different chapters, were, and probably still are, seen as a drain on the time of its shop staff. You'd have a more difficult time convincing them what they really need is a £130 starter set and a box of Primaris Marines. Instead, what GW are really looking for are the naive customers, who don't yet know what they want, and so can be convinced of what they're going to buy. Either because they're entirely new to the hobby and are just dipping their toe into wargaming for the first time, or because their parents buying a gift for a kid. And that's why the key performance indicators for the stores revolve around the launch boxes. It's maintaining that steady stream of new players into the hobby at a faster rate than people dropping out of it at the other end. This all came up recently in a fantastic set of interviews hosted by Little Walls TV with Rick Priestley and Northern Exile on the history of Warmaster, where they discuss things like the place of what sometimes gets called specialist games within the business, the type of gamer who gravitates towards those things, and the critical importance of a self-contained plastic box set when launching a new system. As a company, of course, you'll have a hard time drawing in new people if there exist all of those little bumps in the road in the way of them getting started with the hobby, like having to dig your way through orders of battle to understand typical army compositions for a conflict, and then navigating a load of product codes in sales catalogues to put together a force of hundreds of figures sold in individual blister packs. Although it was a fantasy setting rather than a historical one, this was the problem that faced the release of Warmaster by the sounds of it. It was a new rule system, with a different design philosophy to Warhammer Fantasy, involving a different type of army composition, at a different scale, requiring different scenery, using metal figures sold in small blister packs. Not having a plastic starter set at launch was a problem. Somewhat ironically, when they did eventually release something like that, for an adaptation of the Warmaster rules in Middle-earth, there was still precious little shelf space or demo room for them to promote it properly in stores, but that's beside the point. Now, to make these starter boxes a more attractive proposition, they're often fairly good value, which means veteran hobbyists alike can benefit from their existence. And of course, I hope it goes without saying, we all have to start somewhere, without as much knowledge or experience in the hobby, and without yet really knowing what we want from a product. Whether that's in wargaming as a whole, or when picking up something new, such as a 3D printer, an airbrush, or a different period or rule system. So don't infer some judgment based on what anyone purchases or when as part of their hobby. I'm also going to try not to become one of those doom merchants who worries about a greying of the hobby on one day and then frets over efforts to make it more accessible the next. So positive vibes for the time being. Right, caveats out the way. It's taken a while for these big, plastic starter set type products to filter their way through to historical, and indeed simply non-Games Workshop wargames, aside from the bigger systems like Bolt Action and Flames of War that have had them for some time now. But this is the kind of thing we're now starting to see, and nowhere more prominently than in the new offerings at Salute. It's been a steady progression, but increasingly we've gone from having small print runs of rule systems to bigger glossy publications with fancy pictures throughout, requiring much larger print runs to keep the unit price down. Then with dedicated figure ranges, originally in metal but keeping everything in-house and listed alongside the rule set, to next having bespoke multi-part plastic sets for individual rules, requiring a huge outlay on machining for injection moulding, to finally drawing all of this together into an all-singing, all-dancing starter set. Something that contains a getting started guide, a rulebook, 2 balanced forces, both in plastic, some scenery, often in plastic as well, and all the required gaming aids like tokens and bespoke dice. It seems to be working out for those companies that have managed the cost of doing so. Great Escape Games previously did it with Dead Man's Hand Redux as a starter set, and chose Salute as the launch for Flat Caps and Truncheons, another big starter box for their game The Chicago Way. Similarly, Grey for Now Games repeated the starter set format that they used for the World War II skirmish game 0200 Hours from a couple of years ago with a launch box for Guards of Traitor Toll, again timed to launch at Salute. Third, Footsaw Miniatures and Wargames Atlantic were in on it as well, with the release of a big 2nd edition box set for Baron's War, Again, with everything from custom dice to plastic terrain, figures, a rulebook, and so on. And then, of course, beyond these skirmish offerings, we have the continued success of Warlord Games' epic scale range, which they'll be adding to later this year with a range for the American War of Independence, following a similar two-army starter set format that they did for the Waterloo campaign, ACW, the Punic Wars, and either the ECW or 30 Years' War. So what do we take from all this? First, like I've already mentioned, these things cannot be cheap to produce. So the fact that they're being manufactured at all in the first place, at the kind of scale that they would need to make them financially viable, shows that these firms are confident in the health of the market. Just under a decade ago, we'd have probably viewed a high-profile release of a new historical system as one that had a couple of MDF tokens alongside it, let alone a full box set of bespoke plastic sprues. Second, it's also an indication of a real concerted effort by companies, as GW did in the past, to smooth out those bumps in the road experienced by everyone new to a particular project, rule set, period, system, or what have you. People can be quite sceptical nowadays, I think, about the extent to which GW really does serve as a gateway into historical wargaming, beyond simply monopolising the market to the extent where people outside the hobby conflate Warhammer and wargaming as if they're the same thing. Regardless of any truth to those arguments, it's hard to maintain the same view about something like Guards of Traitor's Toll, given Grey4Now Games' involvement in World War II systems as well, let alone something like Baron's War. We now have, in this corner of the hobby, a much more similar product experience for beginners to that which saw Games Workshop achieve the international success that it has than at any time before. Another sign of this, I'd argue, is with that other big trend of releases this year towards pre-printed, full-colour MDF terrain. Much more expensive to produce, I'd expect, requiring larger production runs to make them viable, but undoubtedly something that makes it simpler for gamers to achieve good-looking tables at home, without them needing to learn a whole separate hobby of terrain manufacture. Third, a much more contentious or even problematic point this one, we may start to see a change in that common criticism levelled against historical wargaming by those used to the big fantasy and sci-fi systems, about how difficult it can be to find opponents to play against. It's not by coincidence that as a 40k player you can find a game in pretty much any town up or down the country. This is on nowhere near the same scale, of course, nor does it represent anything like the same domination of the market that Games Workshop has, but we do see something similar of this kind, I'd argue, with games like Dead Man's Hand now. Something that, purely anecdotally, I often hear people mentioning as a pickup game that they'll bring along or travel with since they know many other people who play it. A concern with all this, I guess, is that just how we've seen the stakes changing in rules publications, to the point where glossy books are now the expectation, meaning that more niche periods don't get as much of a look in because they simply aren't deemed financially viable for publishers. We may at some point start to see those expectations lifted even higher still to encompass plastic launch boxes as well, further diminishing the breadth of the hobby. If it's already difficult to justify publishing a rulebook for a more obscure period today, then imagine in a couple of years' time what it would be like if this trend continues and it becomes the norm for every big release to be accompanied by figures, scenery, dice, and the like. Who knows? It's promising, I think, that whereas we have a big player in the shape of Warlord Games, there's nowhere near the same domination of the market that Games Workshop has exerted over fantasy and sci-fi rules. It's not just one company that is bringing out these launch boxes, but several across different styles of game and periods, albeit skewing towards skirmish rule sets still. So, general thoughts out the way. Reveals time. What did I pick up at Salute, and what's that future project I've been mentioning that led to all of this? Well, drum roll, it's Bismarck's Wars. Definitely a bit more obscure than some other periods, despite releases like the plastic figure range the Perrys have been bringing out, but you'll see now, hopefully, why I've been thinking so much about viability in the landscape of the hobby. Here are the books I picked up. Ralph Weaver's 2-volume set on the uniforms, organisation and weapons of the armies in the Franco-German War, published by Helion, and Volume 1 of Grenville Byrd's study of the Franco-German War, also published by Helion, plus a box of the Perrys' New Bavarian figures. There is context to all this in terms of how I got into 19th century stuff in the first place, through academia as a music historian, so it's by no means a spur of the moment thing. And in fact, this is a period I know much more about socially and culturally than the Napoleonic Wars at all, given my area of research. But regardless, in terms of the hobby, this process of starting up a new period is what got me thinking about everything in today's video. On the question of rule sets, it's impossible to ignore that as a more obscure period, there aren't as many big publications out there. From a few of the conversations I had over the weekend, Michael Perry mentioned using black powder, but there's also the lists for Valour and Fortitude, which I imagine they'll add to with the Bavarians in due course, while Ken Riley discussed Pickett's Charge, which he was using for his fantastic Risorgimento game. I would love for there to be more out there for the period, but then it's also nice to do something a bit more independently than just following an already well-trodden path, as with Napoleonics. So don't expect much of this anytime soon on the channel. This is a long-term thing, and I like just getting my research in place first and sorting out what I'm going to do a while before I start painting stuff up. But I thought I'd share where my thoughts are going anyway with it. As for other bits I picked up, I rushed across to the Eureka Miniatures stand pretty early on, having heard great things about the GDA2 tokens by Battlefield Accessories that they stocked, and having missed out on getting any last year. The different packs here are some game markers, CNC orders, and a Battlefield tracker contraption. I also got some casualty markers from war bases. I'm planning to use these for the Prussian casualty figures that I picked up from Calpay as part of my order before the sale of the company. I also got some more scenery bits from Warpainter Scenics. I had some trees and a smaller field from them last year and was really impressed with both the quality and the value of them. Some new brushes from Artis Opus to replace my now rather aged set. I'm not sure when they changed the boxes they came in, but this is how they look now, compared with this, which is how they used to look. Not that it affects the quality of the paintbrushes, of course. And then, smaller things, I got the 3D printed base for Paul Hicks's wonderful show miniature of Lieutenant Colonel James McDonnell, and the usual clutter like a mug and some dice. So, anyway, let me know your thoughts on where things are headed with these starter sets in the hobby down in the comments, or maybe just share what you enjoyed about Salute if you were there. Thanks as ever for listening to my ramblings, and until next time.